Night at the Movies, a series of programs on the movies, their aims, their problems, and how these relate to the films we see on our movie screens. Our guest tonight is Amos Vogel, Executive Secretary of Cinema 16. Interviewing him is your host for these programs, Arthur Knight. Mr. Knight is film critic for the Saturday Review, teacher at the City College Institute of Film Technique, and author of A History of the Movies, The Liveliest Art. Here now is Arthur Knight.
Good evening. We hear a good deal about the angry young men of literature these days, in England, in France, in Germany, in Poland, and of course in this country too. John Osborne, John Brain, here in the United States, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg. It's a worldwide movement which literary critics are beginning to treat more seriously as they recognize its proportions and implications. They are, perhaps reluctantly, dropping the epithets beat and beatnik in favor of such sober and accurate adjectives as troubled, controversial, and angry. Well, film has its angry young men too, although as yet there's been little identification as such. Perhaps the angriest at this moment are Dennis and Terry Sanders, who you may remember were guests of this program earlier in the year. They'd been signed by MGM to make a film based on Kerouac's The Subterraneans. When Arthur Freed, the producer, discovered that what they were filming was no lily-white love story with Leslie Caron, he fired them. Actually, the studio's no place to look for angry young men. Not the big-time American studios, anyway. The motto of these young people is freedom of expression. Their attitudes are unconventional, their approach is personal. And studio filmmaking, with its million-dollar budgets, is almost by definition contrary to all these things. No, for the true expression of offbeat philosophy, one must turn to the film societies. Even as in publishing, we find the literary efforts of this new lost generation not in the Saturday Evening Post, but in the Evergreen Review and similar little magazines. Certainly the best known and most successful of these film societies is New York's own Cinema 16. Started 11 years ago by Amos Vogel, it's become the recognized center for the exhibition of personal, creative filmmaking, the place one turns to find new directions in film experiment. Amos Vogel was our guest on this program just about a year ago, speaking about the Film Society movement in general as it's developed across the country. Because he's in the unique position of screening just about every new and experimental work produced either here or abroad, I've asked him back to discuss with us this evening the angry young filmmakers and their relation to the angry young men of literature. Amos Vogel, it's very good to see you again.
Thank you, Arthur.
Amos, it's my impression that in this country, at least, these very personal, very individual films actually antedated the work of the angry young men. Is this true?
Yes, it is. Films of this sort have been made in this country for at least 15 to 20 years. Most of them were a direct outcome, you might say, of the Second World War. And since then, what at the beginning was simply an expression of individual filmmakers has really become a movement, one might say.
Do you think that the movement, the impulse behind these angry young filmmakers is the same as that which motivates the angry young writers?
Yes, very much so. Both are a response to a social situation which fills these young artists with tension, unhappiness. They're troubled, as you said so correctly before. They're people who feel a certain tension vis-a-vis organized society, a certain discomfort in civilization, to take the name of one of Freud's books. And undoubtedly, the sources for both the filmmakers and the authors are the same.
Civilization and its discontents.
Yes.
Then you feel that they're really angry, not just independent.
Well, both, I would say. Independent in the sense that they have declared that, in a sense, they disaffiliate from society. This term, of course, is open to misunderstanding. It does not mean that they have lost interest in society, but it does mean that they are not willing to participate in the, let us say, success game.
And the amenities?
The amenities of present-day civilization. They're very much aware of tensions and problems inherent in our societal setup without having the answers. They're simply expressing a mood and a feeling of personal dissatisfaction, which very often in their works reaches social proportions, let us say. When we, 20, 30 years ago, there were the social documentaries.
Yes.
And in a sense, their place today has been taken by these films because the social documentaries are no longer being made. The documentaries become too successful, too pro-status quo, let us say, too glossy.
Too sponsored.
Too sponsored, very true. And here again are people who attempt to express problems they feel, their own problems and problems of the society they live in.
Yes, but Amos, wouldn't you say this? The documentaries of the 30s made a forthright attack on our social structure, on social evils which they underlined, whereas I can think of no experimental film, no film of these angry young filmmakers which points an accusing finger at any social disorientation. They're much more concerned with how all of this affects them. It's a much more interior thing.
Well, first of all, I would say that the so-called certainties of the 1930s, as expressed in the social documentaries, have given way to the uncertainties of our generation. In the 30s, it was very simple for people to make direct statements of social protest, and they felt that they had the answers. Since then, many of them and many of us have discovered that the questions posed by modern civilizations are much more complicated, and that in a sense it is a progressive step even to express one's uncertainty and then to proceed from there. Now, I would not say that there have been no films that dealt directly, or let us say in some way directly, with social issues. There have been. For example, one of the films on this year's program at Cinema 16 is a film made at the University of Southern California by a young graduate student under the rather, I would say, unlikely title, Have I Told You Lately That I Love You? Now, this is a film which deals with the depersonalization of contemporary life. It deals with a middle-class family and how they are dominated by gadgets and how the interpersonal relationships in their lives have been completely subordinated and swamped by gadgets and by the various so-called conveniences of modern life. This is just one small example. Then, if you take another film on our program, John Cassavetes' film, Shadows.
I've heard about that. I haven't seen it, though.
Yes, that's, I think, is probably one of the most important independent films of the last decade, even, I would say.
I understand it's a completely improvised picture.
Yes, yes. And this film deals with the night people. It deals with the various, let us say, hipsters, chicks, jazz musicians, floaters of Times Square, and deals thereby directly with a social problem without, however, providing any answer or any solution or attempt at a message. It is simply a statement. Another film, you mentioned before Kerouac and Ginsberg. There's another film made by Robert Frank and Alfred Leslie, Pull My Daisy, which is a direct filmic expression of certain of the values of the Beat generation. Jack Kerouac provides a commentary, incidentally, again, a spontaneous commentary. He saw the film once and then recorded a narration for it on the spot. This element of improvisation that you mentioned is also very important in these films because under the influence of a number of social philosophies and religious philosophies, such as, for example, Zen Buddhism.
Such as particularly Zen.
Yes. There is an attempt to return to greater spontaneity in all media, and the importance of spontaneity and improvisation. Unlike the fully written out scenarios of the Hollywood films, there's an attempt to get back, as they would say, to the sources of life, which in a very indirect and interesting way is related, you might say, to Flaherty, who felt that there should be no preconception and one should go and record reality as it is and not as one would like it to be.
Yes, you get the sense of reality creeping in because the actions, the reactions have not been planned out carefully in advance. Amos Vogel, I know that last year you attended the Brussels International Festival of Experimental Films. Do you find these same influences abroad?
Oh, yes, very much so. This is entirely an international movement. It proceeds on different levels in various countries. For example, in certain countries it is much more political than it is in America. There's an interesting correlation between the American beats and the angry young men in England. But in England, since there is a Labour Party and a much more political tradition, let us say, than here, the work of these young people, which incidentally was described as the free cinema, is much more political and much more directly social in content than the work of the American filmmakers.
Yes, theirs comes very close to documentary, it seems to me.
In a sense, yes. But unofficial, raw, unrestrained documentary.
Amos, Poland has emerged recently as a center of experimental production. We've seen some feature films from Poland. Eighth Day of the Week, Eve Wants to Sleep, which I think is coming up on your program this year, and also some short experimental works. Why do you suppose there's this activity in Poland?
Well,
of all places.
Yes. Well, there's a very definite and very good reason for it. This development followed Gomulka's rise to power in Poland, and of course, again, there we have a country in a state of great tension, great restlessness, not only vis-a-vis the world, but vis-a-vis its own values, a re-examination of its own values. And these filmmakers reflect that, and it is interesting that the Polish government has given them freedom to express these things on film. Not only freedom, but has given them the finances to do so. Poland is practically the only country in the world today which supports experimental and independent film production. And these people deal very forthrightly, and this is quite surprising for Westerners, with their own social realities and problems. They criticize, they ridicule. For example, Eva Wants to Sleep is a satire, feature-length satire on planning, bureaucracy, government, police, yes. Then there's another film, The Last Day of Summer, which won Grand Prix at Venice last year, which, if anything, is an existentialist statement full of despair, but also full of social significance, again, coming from Poland.
Gomulka won't like this. I've noticed, at least in France, that there's a whole new wave of angry young directors at work in the studios. Camus, Hakim, Hossein, Louis Malle, Claude Chabrol, Francois Truffaut. And their films are turning up over here in the art houses, not at Cinema 16. Do you consider this in any way a portent of the future?
You mean for other countries?
No, I mean really for what's going to happen here.
Well, I certainly hope so. I would like, and all of these filmmakers, of course, would like to break into the commercial cinema and to have their films seen not just by film society audiences, but by larger audiences in art theaters. The only thing is that perhaps this movement in France is, let us say, somewhat less angry and somewhat more aware of the values of sex at the box office than the other independent filmmakers in other countries.
I was going to use the word disenchanted.
But these films, these French films, do reflect a sense of disenchantment, as you very correctly put it, and disillusionment with the official values of society. They do reflect that in varying degrees, especially Chabrol's films. And as such, they do belong into the same mainstream of contemporary film production.
Chabrol's film, The Cousins, is going to be coming here soon.
Yes, I was thinking. Yes, I was thinking especially of that film.
Now, would you say that this movement, which incidentally involves largely intellectuals, would you say that it's grown out of, or at least been influenced by, the considerable Cine Club Film Society movement that exists in France?
Yes, very much so. As a matter of fact, some of the people, most of the people involved in the movement are people who have either been Film Society members or film critics writing for rather esoteric magazines originally.
Film critics?
Yes.
Filmmakers of all things.
Chabrol, of course, is one example. Truffaut is another one. Yes. And there's an undeniable connection, of course.
Truffaut's film, The 400 Blows, has just come here. It's going to be opening fairly soon.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think there's any chance of that same thing happening here, that the young intellectuals will be able to make this kind of independent, experimental, disenchanted film in this country?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic about this, but I'm not. I would say, first of all, that the commercial cinema here is, in a sense, better organized and thereby better able to keep such films out. And secondly, perhaps few of these people have resource to independent financing, such as the French directors did, where in many cases it was a matter of even an inheritance or some such thing helping along. And in this country, most of these filmmakers are rather poor, and the people who do have the money are not yet ready, let us say, to finance them. And the example you mentioned earlier of the Sanders brothers, of course, is an interesting one, because they attempted to break into commercial filmmaking and do this type of thing, at least to some extent, and have not so far been too successful.
Now, I gather from everything that has been reported in the trade press that they were very serious about putting Kerouac on the screen as Kerouac and not sweetened up for a Leslie Caron star film.
Yes.
And that was where the rub came, when the officials at MGM got around to realizing what was going on.
Yes. Let us say it's not yet profitable to make such films.
What I was thinking really was, what about the Film Society movement here? Is it in any sense strong enough to support that kind of filmmaking?
I would say no.
Now, getting back to home, what would you say is the primary impetus behind the production of these offbeat films? Certainly they don't expect to grow rich on them.
Yes, the impetus is primarily one of self-expression. To say what one feels on film, just as a poet will say it in a poem, or an author in a story. And there is no sense of commercial values there. I mean, if a film is made and makes money, fine. And of course, they're attempting to place these films into distribution. For example, a film such as Shadows has a very good chance of going into art theaters, or Pull My Daisy. But on the other hand, this is not the primary intention at all. It's not the intention in the first place. The intention is simply to express what one feels.
Do you imagine that the limited edition kind of picture, if you can call it that, this limited circulation that these films have, at least supports the production of this kind of film?
In some cases, yes. In more cases, no. At least not as of this point. There is some distribution of these films outside of the commercial channels. For example, we ourselves have a distribution setup which is limited entirely to films of this type, and which now reaches all 48 states, art museums, film societies, civic organizations. But it's not yet large enough for that kind of thing.
Now, how about the audiences? How do your audiences at Cinema 16 receive films of this type?
Very well. very well. Of course, all of these films are very controversial, so that you can expect a controversial audience reaction. They are meant, in a sense, to be controversial, and if anything, to antagonize. But I think this is all to the good. I think what the contemporary cinema needs and can stand is controversy and greater feeling, let us say, of participation on the part of the audience, either positively or negatively.
Stir up the animals.
Yes.
Do they play a major part in your Cinema 16 programming?
Well, this year they do play a larger part than usual. The reason very simply being that more of these films have been made. I guess things are getting more difficult all around, despite the fact that everybody is eating well and making money. So that there are more such films, and we are showing them as a result. But nevertheless, I would not say that they make up more than 30% of our programs.
What else do you have on Cinema 16?
Well, we have a very large variety of films. You know, we have prize-winning shorts, cinema classics, features of all nations, and they range, over the entire range of the cinema medium. We feel that ours is a showcase for all the various things the cinema can do, and the cinema can do much more than to present, love stories or the regular theatrical type of feature. We have scientific films, we have some very interesting art films from rather offbeat places such as China and India. We have a film, A Night at the Peking Opera, a film on Indian art, which describes the sacred temple statuary in India, with a religious philosophy quite different from ours, a humanization of the gods and a deification of love and sex, for example. We have a large number of scientific films this year, a very interesting Japanese film, The World of the Microbes, which shows a 70-hour struggle between a white blood corpuscle and a tubercle bacillus under an electron microscope, and I think it's really the first film of its type. And we have a large number of features which cannot be classified as angry young cinema.
When does all of this begin?
We're starting late in October. There will be 16 programs as usual, about 2 weeks apart. And I think we will show a total of about 40 films.
And the screenings to be at the Central Needle Trades High School auditorium on Wednesday evenings, and at the
Beekman Theater on Sunday, and also at the Murray Hill, a new art theater opening on 34th Street.
Thank you, Amos Vogel, for this illuminating session. Amos Vogel, in case I failed to mention it earlier, is the Executive Secretary of Cinema 16, a non-profit educational organization.